This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. For this kōrero, we're picking up kind of right where we left off from the last episode. So if you're just tuning in for this one, not to worry, you'll still be able to follow along. But last episode, I did an episode inspired by one of my favorite trashy TV shows, Love Island, because like anything else, it really is that deep and it really is that political. And at the end of last episode, we were talking about the double standards and the virtue signaling behind, the term girl's girl, and when the girls chose to use it and when they chose not to. It was just really, really interesting pattern that I noticed while watching this episode. It's not unique to Love Island as well. Girl's girl has been a term that's been around, it's been used in so many different ways as well. And I've just, notice this pattern about how it gets used, who says it, who is and isn't deemed a girl's girl. So we're gonna pick up from that point and just generally talk about virtue signaling for this episode, which is really, really interesting. Really, really interesting. So my main, thesis, if we're going to get academic about it for today, is that the loudest argument in public life right now isn't really left versus right or online versus offline. It's cheap versus costly. Because if you think about it, every single day we're flooded with moral signals, right? Whether it's hashtags or squares or girl's girl or she's problematic, he's a good one. And none of those things actually ask us the one question that would help us sort the real from the hollow, which is, what did this cost the person who said it? Not did they mean it, because honestly, you will never be able to know that. And I feel like, it's kind of a bit of a nothing burger. But what did it cost them? And I think that's the whole ball game, and that's a lot more question than virtue signaling, yes or no. And, like with everything in the show, it is nuanced. There are, multiple things that can be true at the same time. And the same goes with this episode as well. I am going to be asking you to hold things that feel contradictory at the same time the whole way through this kōrero. One, genuine, empty, self-serving moral performance. It is real. It happens constantly, and naming it does matter. And then the other thing, the accusation, the virtue signaling is now used far more often to shut down real moral speech than to catch fake moral speech. And I think both of those things are true simultaneously. And, it is kind of uncomfortable, allowing both to exist or sitting with both, as opposed to not collapsing it into, either everyone who posts about a cause is a fraud or any criticism of activism is right-wing bad faith. I think this discomfort and that tension line, that is where we're going to be sitting for this episode. So, buckle in, let's take a seat, let's get into it. Because I think this nuanced part is really where we need to sink our teeth into. So, let's kind of start at a good place with, virtue signaling. Where did that phrase come from, and why is it important to talk about where it came from? So most people use virtue signaling like it's always existed, like it's a neutral bit of language, kind of like maybe the way we say like gaslighting or trigger warning, but it hasn't always existed. It has a specific author. And I think, knowing where it came from, I think really helps understand how we should be using that term. the phrase was popularized, note I say popularized, not invented, and made mainstream by a British journalist named James Bartholomew, in an article for The Spectator in April 2015. Oh my God, that sounds like yonks ago. So The Spectator, for anyone who doesn't know, because I didn't know before doing research for this episode, but it's a British conservative magazine. And you know what? It's not a smear. I'm not coming for The Spectator's neck. It's just context, and context is really important. So the original piece was pretty specific in its targets. Bartholomew wrote about a poster he'd seen from Whole Foods with some vague language about shared values. And he wrote about BBC presenters criticizing a right-wing political party as a way of signaling their own open-mindedness. He wrote about people who'd say, quote, "I hate the Daily Mail," as, a kind of shorthand for, "I'm a good left-wing caring person," without that statement requiring them to actually do anything caring. And his main thing, which, is a pretty sharp observation, was this: virtue signaling doesn't require you to actually do anything virtuous. You don't have to deliver meals to an elderly neighbor. You don't have to stay in a difficult relationship for your kid's sake. You don't have to give anything up. You just have to say the right words in the right tone to the right audience, and you get the social credit anyway. Which is really, really, really interesting. Really interesting. And, he described this moral posturing as positional good. And positional good is something whose whole value comes from you having more of it than other people, not from any use it has on its own. Kind of think of it like a luxury handbag whose entire appeal is that not everyone can have one. If everyone had a, Chanel bag, I don't even know if that's a luxury brand, to be fair. I don't know nothing about bags. But if everyone had one, it would stop being valuable, because the whole value was never really about the handbag. It was about, being seen to be above the crowd, or, now that I've really run off this handbag metaphor, maybe you just genuinely like bags and you don't care about other people. But anyways, the value comes from, the value, what the message says, rather than the bag itself. And, his argument was moral credibility can work the exact same way. If everyone said, "I hate the Daily Mail," or maybe the New Zealand version, Aotearoa version of that would be, "I hate stuff," all the shade to stuff, it would stop, functioning as a status marker. It only works as a signal of your moral standing, because it distinguishes you from people who don't say it. And, this idea is actually way older than this article that came out in 2015. It goes back to 1899. This economist named Thorsten Veblen, I hope I said that correctly, coined the term conspicuous consumption to describe the exact same thing: buying and displaying things specifically because they're expensive and visible, not because you need them, purely to signal your social position to everyone watching. And so, this economist Veblen was talking about the Gilded Age of super rich, but Bartholomew kind of took that framework and spoke about the moral language instead. And I think this is really worth sitting with, because first, the foundational definition of virtue signaling was never really about whether someone believed what they said. It was about status, and it was about distinguishing yourself from the crowd, which, is a claim about the motive, something nobody outside that speaker's own head can ever fully verify. And I think that becomes a relevant point later on. And I think another thing worth noting, the term didn't stay in its original fairly narrow lane, right? Bartholomew himself wrote a follow-up piece 6 months later, quite excited watching the phrase, get picked up across British and then American media, used by people across a political spectrum, applied to basically anything that smelt like public moral expression. And so by 2020, the term had become common enough that it showed up in BBC's own internal editorial guidelines as a phrase journalists need to handle carefully because of how politically loaded it has become. So I think here we come to the first ear bite that I want all of us to chew on, which is virtue signaling isn't a neutral diagnostic tool that just kind of fell from the sky. It's a term that was born inside a specific ideological project. It's a conservative critique of what its author saw as cheap, performative, left-wing moralizing. And it has since been, loaded into, something that sounds like plain, obvious common sense. Almost nobody who uses the phrase today knows it. I guarantee almost no one who uses the phrase today knows that history or thinks about the fact that the term itself is doing rhetorical work, not just descriptive work. And so that's not to say that the concept is useless or that only conservatives can use it fairly. Plenty of people across the political spectrum now aim it at corporate rainbow washing, at celebrity activism, all sorts of things. And, we are going to get into some of these examples, but it does mean every time you reach for that's just virtue signaling, you're reaching for a tool that was forged with a specific political edge, whether you're aware of it or not. And I think that is worth knowing before you swing that axe. It's worth knowing that. So if the term has kind of the slippery, loaded history, does that mean that the phenomenon isn't describing isn't real? No. Genuinely empty, self-serving moral performance is absolutely real. It happens all the time on every side of every issue. The question is how to actually identify it with with a bit of rigor, instead of just using the phrase as a vibe. And this is where I want to bring in two academic philosophers who have done, a lot of the nuanced and careful work on this exact problem. So we have Justin Tossi and Brandon Warmke, I really hope I've said that correctly, who wrote a whole book called Grandstanding, The Use and Abuse of Moral Talk. And you know what? They deliberately avoid the phrase virtue signaling because of how politically contaminated it's become, and instead build a more precise concept, which I think, is a better tool. You're kind of hitting bullseye with this rather than just saying that's virtue signaling. And this concept is called moral groundstanding. So groundstanding has two moving parts. Part one is a recognition desire. And this just means, I want to be seen by other people as morally impressive. Not like a small incidental want, maybe that'd be nice. It's a strong feeling, you would so strong to the point that you would feel genuinely disappointed or annoyed if nobody noticed. And then the other part of this is a grandstanding expression. And this is the actual public act, whether it's the post or the speech or the phrase used or the comment. And that's designed to satisfy that recognition desire. And I think here's a crucial, genuinely underrated point in the whole framework. Grandstanding is not defined by what you say, it's defined by why you're saying it, which means, and I think this is the part that we need to sit with a little bit longer, you literally cannot reliably identify grandstanding from the outside just by reading someone's post. Two people can write the exact same sentence about the exact same cause, word for word, and one of them is grandstanding and the other one genuinely isn't, because the difference lies entirely inside a psychological state. The observer, you don't have access to that. So I think, let's just sit with that for a second, because it is a genuinely humbling point. Every single time you scroll past someone's post and think, well, that's just virtue signaling, or that's just obviously to say something without saying anything, really, to say a lot with saying a little. You're making a claim about the inside of someone else's head that you cannot verify. And you might be right. People's patterns of behavior over time do give you real evidence. If there's a person or a business, let's not make this personal. This could be structural as well. A business or institution who only ever posts about a cause during the trending week, never before or after, that does give you a genuine, point to a genuine pattern. But the single post in isolation tells you almost nothing about the motive. It tells you about the content, but the motive is invisible. And so the authors also map out specific forms of grandstanding that you can observe. And I think it's important to run through these. Hopefully it will give you more tools to add to your kete. So when you are having thoughts about virtue signaling, or it's something that you've noticed, you can have something to grab onto and use. So there's a piling on, which is jumping into a pile up of criticism against someone, not because your specific voice adds anything new, but because being visibly part of the crowd condemning something gets you moral credit by association. And I think this one is particularly interesting when, coupled up with our rampant cancel culture. And again, this is nuanced. Some people, and I'm not saying that accountability doesn't matter. It absolutely does, especially when, money is involved and businesses and people and just systems are like making money off their not cool moral standpoints. I think this is why, personally, I'm like particularly critical of like who I support, especially if there's money being involved with it. Like, for example, the new Harry Potter series, I actually don't know if it's out or not, but I'm not too sure if I want to like put money behind watching it, because if that money goes back to Joanne's pocket, we all know what Homegirl is using her money for. And that's just something personally I don't want to support. So I get it, that we do need to be holding people and systems and structures to account. But also our cancel culture is rampant. And it is when people just like switch up their thoughts and opinions to the point where it's clear that they just liked participating in the cancelling of someone or something, rather than taking a critical moral stance on what's going on. So yeah, I think the piling on is really interesting with the cancel culture that we love performing in these days. Then there's ramping up, which is escalating your language past what the situation actually calls for, because more dramatic language reads as more morally serious. Someone else called it concerning, so you're going to call it the worst thing you've ever seen. And not because that's accurate, but because it's more morally impressive. Then there's trumping up, treating a fairly minor moral issue like it's a 5-alarm emergency, because urgency performs well. Then there's expressing strong emotions, which is, publicly displaying outrage or grief or heartbreak in a way that's calibrated more for how it reads to an audience than for how you're actually processing the thing privately. And then there's dismissiveness, which is waving away an entirely complicated issue with a single, line or a glib, because looking like you're above the whole messy debate is its own status move. So this is where I want to make the turn that I think a lot of like virtue signaling 101 content misses completely, especially that last one, dismissiveness, waving away a complicated issue to look like you're above the mess. And that's not just a description of performative activism. That is almost word for word a description of what happens every single time someone types lol, virtue signaling under a post and moves on. The accusation itself is frequently a textbook grandstanding expression. It has its own recognition desire, the desire to be seen as clear-eyed and unbothered and too smart to be fooled by performative nonsense. It has its own grandstanding expression, which is the dismissive one-liner. So, by the author's own framework, when, you say that's just virtue signaling, it's very often grandstanding about not grandstanding, if that makes sense. And I think that's where I really want to sit with today. It's grandstanding wearing an anti-grandstanding costume, because it dresses itself up as skepticism rather than moralizing, and it gets to completely skip the scrutiny that moralizing usually invites or asks for. And, nobody accuses the cynic of showing off, but the cynic is very often showing off too, just showing off a different quality. Not compassion, but detachment. And detachment in a lot of online spaces right now, it kind of has a particular read to it, which is unbothered, above it all, too sharp to be moved. And yeah, I think that's really, really, really interesting. Naming genuine moral grandstanding is a legitimate, useful thing to do. It happens, it's worth calling out, especially if it's a pattern. But the accusation virtue signaling, as it's actually deployed in most everyday course, has become a thought-terminating cliche rather than a genuine diagnostic tool. It's a way of sounding critical while doing the least possible amount of actual thinking, which is really, really interesting, I feel like. Really, really interesting. So if the motive is invisible and basically unknowable from the outside, what can we actually look at instead? And I kind of want to change tack and move to a different field, which is evolutionary biology and economics, which sounds random, but they've kind of solved a version of this exact problem ages ago for a completely different reason, but the framework transfers almost perfectly. So here's the puzzle biologists were trying to solve. Why does a peacock grow an enormous, heavy, brightly colored tail that makes it slower, more visible to predators, and more expensive to maintain? Which is kind of like asking the peacock, are you trying to live? What's going on here? From a pure survival standpoint, that is a huge flaw. Like, that natural selection should have taken over the driver's wheel and got rid of that. But a researcher named Amal Zahavi, also hope I said that correctly, proposed an answer in the 70s called the handicap principle. And his idea was this: the tail works precisely because it's costly. A weak, sickly, low quality peacock literally cannot afford to grow and maintain that tail. It would kill him. So the tail isn't just decoration, it is proof. It's an honest signal of underlying quality. And it's honest because faking it is too expensive for anyone who doesn't actually have the resources behind it. And, around the kind of the same time, actually, but from what I can tell, completely independently, an economist named Michael Spence was building basically the same model to explain something in the job market, which is why people get university degrees, even in fields that teach them almost nothing directly useful for the job they end up doing. And his answer was, the degree isn't valuable because of what you learned. is valuable because it's costly in time, money, effort, and a genuinely lower ability candidate would have struggled much harder to get through it. And the cost is what makes a signal trustworthy. If a degree were free and instant, it wouldn't tell employers anything because everyone, capable or not, would have one. So, putting these theories together, you get something called costly signaling theory. And I think it's so interesting because this framework was developed in the context of biology and economics, but it very much applies to human social life. The core insight, if you take it all the way down to just plain English, a signal is only trustworthy if faking it would cost the faker something real. So cheap signals, ones anyone can produce regardless of whether the underlying quality is actually there, carry almost no information. But costly signals, ones that would genuinely hurt or drain a low quality sender to produce, carry real information because faking them isn't worth it. Now, if you apply that to moral and political speech, a hashtag costs nothing. A black square costs nothing. Saying, "she's such a girl's girl," costs nothing. Anyone, regardless of what they actually believe or how they actually behave when no one's watching, can produce those signals at zero cost. Which means, according to costly signaling theory, those signals carry almost no reliable information about the sender's actual underlying commitment. And not because, whoever said the thing is necessarily lying, but the format itself cannot distinguish between liars and believers. Everyone, honest or not, looks identical. But compare that to something that actually costs real resources. Money, reputational risk, social standing, time, physical safety. Publicly standing by someone whose cause is currently unpopular with your social circle, actually redistributing money or opportunity, not just attention, showing up to something inconvenient and unglamorous repeatedly with no audience watching and no post to show for it, staying in a hard, uncomfortable disagreement with a friend rather than posting, a clean, satisfying moral dunk on it. All of these things cost something, and because they cost something, they carry real information about your priorities and your commitments and your values in a way that a hashtag just structurally cannot. And this is generally, I think, this is the sharpest possible tool for kind of cutting through that. Is this a real or performative debate? And it's much better than trying to read minds, which, as we just kind of covered, you actually can't do that. So instead of asking, do they really mean it, which is something that we just cannot answer, ask, what would it have cost them to fake this? If the honest answer is nothing at all, you learn something real, not that the person is fake necessarily, but that the format they chose can't tell you either way. If the honest answer is quite a lot, that's genuinely, structurally more trustworthy information, independent on, anyone's inner sincerity. And here's a piece of the actual consumer psychology research that kind of backs this up, with data rather than just theory. There's a well-known study from 2014 where they termed slacktivism, which is small, publicly visible, low-cost acts of token support, like joining a Facebook group or sharing a post. And their finding is really, interesting. It's worth sitting with. It's not simply that token support does nothing. It's just that the social visibility of the token act actually changes what happens next through something psychologists call moral licensing, which is, a well-documented pattern where doing one small good thing gives people a kind of internal permission slip to do less good afterwards because they already banked on that moral credit. Their specific finding was that when an initial show of support is publicly observable, everyone sees you posted it, people are less likely to follow up with a more meaningful, costly contribution. And I actually want to extend this beyond people. I think this very much goes towards institutions and structures and businesses and celebrities and influencers and public figures, which is really interesting. I feel like, and this kind of behavior is perhaps the opposite of what most of us would assume. We tend to think that small public gestures are kind of at least a stepping stone towards bigger ones, like a gateway into deeper commitment. But this research is telling us the opposite can happen. Because the public gesture already delivered the social reward, people saw you, people approved, the psychological box gets ticked, like job done. No further cost required, which means the whole, at least it raises awareness defense is, it's kind of cheap, right? Viral moral gestures need a genuine asterisk on it now, because sometimes it does raise awareness and lead somewhere, but there's real evidence that the specific combination of low cost plus high visibility can actually, act as a short circuit to the deeper commitment that it was supposedly a stepping stone towards. And that's because the visibility alone already paid out the reward that action was chasing. So I think let's just take a quick philosophical detour, because I want to give this particular thought that's been brewing some real room. So underneath the whole virtue signaling conversation sits an assumption that I feel like not a lot of people say out loud. The real virtue is private, silent, hidden. And that the moment virtue becomes visible, becomes public, it's automatically suspect, automatically a little bit corrupted. That assumption has a specific history. It's not some universal, timeless truth about ethics. It's largely inherited from a particular moral tradition. You can trace strands of it through certain readings of Protestant Christianity, where quiet, hidden virtue known only to God was held up as a golden standard against those public displays of piety. And then later through Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy, which insisted that an action only counts as truly moral if it's done purely from a sense of duty, with zero desire for approval or reward mixed in. The instant you want people to see you doing the right thing on this framework, the moral value starts leaking out. And I think that is one, defensible tradition of ethics, but it isn't the only one. There's an older, and I think perhaps in some ways more socially grounded counter tradition going back to ancient civic republicanism, which is the political philosophy of ancient Roman Greece, where public virtue wasn't a corruption of the real thing. It was the real thing. Honor in that tradition was inherently social. You built and demonstrated your character specifically through how you conducted yourself, how you moved in front of your community and with your community, because character that never showed up in public life wasn't considered to be doing any real civil work at all. And this is interesting because that virtue is fundamentally relational, built and proven between people, and not achieved in this isolated, unwitnessed silence. So, what I'm not asking y'all to do right now is to kind of pick a side in this, 2,000 plus year old philosophical argument. And especially in this 50-minute episode, what I'm asking y'all to notice is something simpler. When people accuse each other of virtue signaling, they're usually smuggling in that first tradition, right? That private, hidden, Kantian virtue, as if it were just self-evidently correct, the only real definition of sincerity, without ever actually argued for it. And a huge amount of human moral life across a huge number of cultures and centuries has kind of operated on that second tradition instead, where showing up publicly in front of your community was never the fake version of morality. It was one of the main points of having a community at all. So, which doesn't mean every public gesture is automatically virtuous just because it's public. It means the automatic suspicion of anything visible, that reflex that says, if it's public, it's probably fake, is itself a specific, contestable, philosophical position and not a neutral fact about the universe. And I think it's worth knowing that and just kind of, hearing that, tucking that into the back of your brain and just letting it sit there the next time you think about this, whether it's, on your own screen, your own TV screen, you're scrolling on your phone, all the words coming out of your mouth, I suppose. All right, I feel like this episode, this corridor so far has been lots of theory. So, let's get some receipts. Let's go through some actual real documented things that kind of help us unpack this together. So let's take our minds back to June 2020. We had Blackout Tuesday. In the days after George Floyd's murder, two music industry executives, Jamila Thomas and Brianna Agyemang, I really hope I said that correctly, organized a genuine, specific action. A one-day pause across the music industry, calling on labels and executives to stop business as usual and kind of sit with the fact with how the industry profits from Black artists. And that was the original origin. It was costly, specific, targeted at an industry that could genuinely change its behavior. But what actually spread, though, was something quite different. Millions of ordinary folks, or some more so ordinary, some were celebrities and public figures, but anyways, millions of people, Instagram users, posting a single black square, often using the hashtag Black Lives Matter alongside it. And that hashtag, crucially, it wasn't just a vibe. Organizers and activists on the ground were actively using it in real time to share information about protests, bail funds, and documented instances of police violence. When that hashtag got flooded with over 20 million black squares, it functionally just buried the actual organizing information underneath a wall of aesthetic solidarity. And academic research afterwards, there was a particular study by Mariah Wellman published in 2022 that specifically looked at social media influencers during this period and found that for many of them, the black square functioned as what researchers called credibility maintenance, a strategic move to protect their existing brand and audience relationship, not necessarily a step towards any deeper structural engagement with anti-racism. Most of the same accounts the research found didn't sustain any meaningful change in their content or how the industry practices afterwards. But here's the nuance. The easy dismissal skips. Plenty of individual people who posted that square generally went on to donate, to protest, to change how they voted, to have hard conversations with the family. The action itself was cheap, and actually it was, somewhat harmful to the information ecosystem that activists and organizers were relying on. But that doesn't mean every single person who posted it was grandstanding. Cheap and harmful and aggregate is a different claim than insincere. And those two things get collapsed together constantly, and they shouldn't be. And they really shouldn't be. Here's another example. Also June 2020, kente cloth. So it's a textile with real cultural and historical weight from Ghana and Togo. But anyways, about 24 Democratic members of Congress, including the Speaker of the House at the time, knelt for 8 minutes and 46 seconds in the Capitol wearing stoles made of kente cloth. And, the backlash was immediate and sharp. A researcher at Oxford, Jade Bentel, said publicly that the cloth wasn't created for that use. Critics called it a photo opportunity, staged and costume-like, especially jarring, set against lawmakers kneeling for a precise length of time it took to kill a man. But I think here's a layer that actually complicates that verdict, though. That same event was the public rollout for the Justice and Policing Act of 2020, an actual piece of legislation with actual proposed structural changes, including limits on police immunity and a ban on chokeholds. One of the sharpest critical voices in that moment, the writer and activist April Rain, made a point of separating the two things in real time, saying she wasn't a fan of the kente cloth, but if the actual legislation followed, that was a part worth holding onto and holding people accountable for. Which is, I think, kind of that level of critical thinking and pushing past that initial easy to do, not assumption per se, but assessment. The costume was cheap. The legislation, the use of the costume, just to clarify, not the actual kente cloth. The legislation, whatever you think about its final content or its odds of passing, was at minimum an attempt at something costly. Judging the photo op and judging the policy are two separate acts and kind of collapsing them into one blanket verdict. I think it just costs you real information and exactly the way costly signaling theory would predict. Then we have the rainbow logos every June. A genuinely useful test here. Does the company change its branding, and does it also change its political donations? A number of well-documented cases show companies rolling out rainbow branding in markets where doing so costs nothing and earns real customer goodwill, while simultaneously donating in the same calendar year to politicians with anti-LGBTQIA plus voting records, or selling that same rainbow product in countries where being visibly pro-LGBTQIA plus could bring real risk, and quietly not doing so there at all. I think that gap, that visible cheap solidarity in the low risk market versus that total silence in the high risk one, is again costly signaling theory doing exactly its thing. It's not about, do they seem sincere? It's where does the behavior actually get expensive and does it hold up there? And then we have the girl boss era, which is roughly 2014 through 2020, which is an entire aesthetic and marketing language of individual and female empowerment, wrapped around brands, laid on top of real workplaces that, in a number of well-reported cases, had substantive ongoing issues in how they treated women, particularly women of color, on their own staff. The empowerment language costs the brand nothing. The actual redistribution of power inside those companies, whether there's better pay equity, better parental leave, real promotion pathways for women of color specifically, would have cost something. Guess which one showed up on the Instagram grid and which one didn't. I want y'all to notice the pattern running through all four of these. It's never simply, this is fake versus this is real. It's where specifically in this whole, string of gestures did anyone pay a real cost, whether it was money, risk, social standing, structural power, and where did the gesture stay free? And that's where the actual analysis lies. Not a verdict, not just simply, saying virtue signaling and calling it a day. So I kind of want to bring it back to the episodes ideas that I wanted to get into when I was talking about, the girl's girl and the double standards there, because I think now that we have, just a deeper understanding of virtue signaling, it kind of sharpens it in a way that I understand a lot deeper. So Sarah Ahmed is a queer feminist scholar of color, developed the idea of feminist killjoy, the person who breaks an unspoken social agreement to protect everyone's comfort by naming a problem out loud, and who then gets blamed for the discomfort itself rather than for the underlying issue she's pointing at. So she wrote about willfulness, how women, and particularly women of color, get branded as difficult the moment they refuse to just go along with the room. And then we have Angela McRobbie's post-feminist masquerade, the idea that a culture or a show or a person can perform the surface language of feminism, whether it's like, yay, girls, sisterhood, empowerment, choice, while the actual underlying structure of who gets believed, who gets protected, who gets to be angry without consequence stays exactly the same underneath the costume. And I think here's a sharper version of the point I want to make today, connecting everything all together. Virtue signaling and she's not a girl are not opposite accusations coming from opposite political directions, even though they feel that way. They are structurally the same disciplinary tool aimed in different directions. Because if you think about the, mechanics of each accusation, virtue signaling gets deployed against someone for saying too much, too visibly about a cause. It disciplines people back towards silence, toward keeping your politics private, toward not being a bore about it. Not a girl's girl gets deployed against someone. Very often, as we covered last episode, a woman of color, someone like Jasmine confronting Kevin, or Priya trying to defend herself for saying something inconvenient too directly in a way that disrupts the room's comfort. It disciplines people back towards pleasantness, toward not being a killjoy about it. And it's that same underlying mechanism. Both accusations take a piece of real, costly, sometimes uncomfortable moral or political speech and punish the speaker for the visibility and the inconvenience of the speech itself, rather than engaging with whether the underlying point was true. Both function as thought-terminating cliches. Both let the accuser walk away feeling sharp, correct, above the mess, above the noise, without having done any of the actual work of engaging with the content. And I think this is where it starts to get really interesting. And this is like the fresh point I want to leave y'all with. The post-feminist masquerade and the anti-woke backlash are underneath the opposite political branding doing the exact same labor, keeping the underlying power structure stable by making its disruption look embarrassing rather than making the underlying unfairness look embarrassing. Girl's girl, used as a badge, lets you perform solidarity, which is the McRobbie masquerade, cheaply, without ever actually having to extend real protection to an inconvenient woman. Virtue signaling, used as an accusation, lets you perform detachment, a mirror image masquerade, the pose of being too clear-eyed to be filled cheaply without ever actually having to engage with whether the cause someone raised has merit. Both are costless, both let the user claim the moral or intellectual high ground without paying for it. Both are structurally exactly the cheap signal that costly signaling theory predicts will carry, with almost no real information, except this time the information gap isn't about the person being accused, it's about the accuser. So that's the reframe. When someone reaches for either phrase, she's not a girl's girl, or that's just virtue signaling, the more useful question isn't, are they right about the target? It's, what is this accusation costing the person making it? Almost always the honest answer is nothing at all, which tells you something real about the accusation, whatever the actual merits of the underlying situation, turn out to be. And I kind of want to close with a voice that predates almost everything else we've discussed today by decades. And, someone who I think saw this entire dynamic more clearly than most of what's been written about it since. So Stokely Michael, who later took the name Kwame Ture, was leader of the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee and later the Black Panther Party, credited with popularizing the phrase Black Power in 1966. In a speech he gave that same year, he laid out a critique of white liberal solidarity that I think is a more precise version of costly signaling theory. His argument boiled down was white liberal students at elite universities could afford to march, could afford to attend rallies, could afford to say the right things about equality, specifically because their own economic and social position was already completely secure. Meanwhile, he pointed out, the mothers of those very students working as maids, the janitors, the porters, the actual material position of Black people in that economy remain untouched by any of that marching, any of that language. His very direct challenge to the room was essentially, if you actually believe in this, are you willing to share your economic security? Are you willing to build entirely new institutions that would cost you something real, rather than talking about human relationships in the abstract while changing nothing material about who holds what? And that's basically costly signaling theory, delivered from a stage in Detroit in 1966, decades before, the economic papers or the peacock tales. And, Carmichael wasn't interested in whether those students meant it. He explicitly said the question of sincerity was almost beside the point. He was interested in whether the solidarity would ever become costly, whether it would ever touch actual resources, actual institutions, actual redistribution, or whether it would stay exactly where it was safest and cheapest to stay. In language, in marching, in symbolic gesture, while the underlying economic structure held perfectly still. And I think, that's the sharpest take on basically everything I've been yapping about today. Not is this person a hypocrite? Structure doesn't care about individual hypocrisy. The question is whether the solidarity, the allyship, the girl's girl energy, the virtue, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, whether it gets asked to become costly, whether it ever touches something that would actually hurt to give up. Almost everything we've examined today, the black square, the rainbow logo, the girl boss branding, the Villa's girl's girl crown, the kente cloth, fails that test in exactly the same way for exactly the reason Carmichael named nearly 60 years ago. It's solidarity priced at zero, offered by people who are never going to be asked to pay anything real for that. And that's a wrap on that. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns, and catch you for the next one.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.